Hey guys, happy Friday. It's Friday, so we're gonna do dictation, which I think is like one of the funnest things that we do. You need a piece of paper, you need something to write with. Remember, we're gonna make it look like this. So you have, where's the camera? There we go. 16 lines on it. And then you're gonna mark those lines to create the symbols for beats. So remember, if you hear one, you leave it, it gets a quarter note. If you hear like two te, you put a slash, and then you put the eighth notes beneath it. If you hear three, you do a tie, and it gets a half note. And if you hear, then you turn it into an R, and you put the quarter rest underneath it. So I decided I was gonna up the difficulty level a little bit today. Up until today, we've been doing like one te, two te, four, and things like that. Today, I'm going to do it on a neutral syllable, and a neutral syllable is just a sound. So today, I'm just going to do it on D, D, D. So when you hear me go D, 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 you need to think in your head what the numbers would be. So if it were D, 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 you would have to think one te, two te, four. Give it a shot. Remember, this isn't for a grade. Nothing is for a grade. It's fine. So like, just try. Like, I don't know. I think it's fun. It just adds a new level of complexity to the game. Okay, here's your first example. Here we go. D, D, D. Mark the sticks first. If you try to write the notes, it's not going to be as successful. You won't get it as quickly. Okay, here it is again. Here we go. D, D, D. I'll do it a third time, okay? Last time. Here we go. D, D, D. Okay. Here is the answer. Pause it if you need to. So you heard D, D, D. In your head, hopefully you were thinking two, te, three, and that's what it becomes. We are for rest, we slash for eighth notes, we tie for half notes. Bada bing, and there it is. D, D, D. Okay, I hope you did all right. Here is your next example. It is just this next top measure. Here we go. D, 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 D. Okay, second time, mark the sticks. Here we go. D, 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 D. And last time. Here we go. D, 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 D. You ready for the answer? Okay, pause it if you need to. Here you go. So first beat was just D. So we leave it because that's a quarter note. That's like one. And then after that, you heard D, 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 like two te, three te, four te. So you put all the slashes there. You got your eighth notes underneath, and that's what it reads. It goes one, two te, three te, four te. Huzzah! I hope you got it right. And if you didn't, it's fine. Everything's fine. Okay, then the last example is the entire bottom row. So remember, in your counting in your brain, when you get to the bar line here, the numbers start over. So it'll be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. You start the numbers over in your brain. Okay, I will do this one 2 times. Then I will break up the measures, and then I will do it one more time, okay? Here it is the whole way through. It's okay, don't freak out. This is new. You probably won't get it the first time. Here we go. D, 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 D. Something that I tell my students when we're working on something like this, when we get to that bottom one, if you get lost partway through, that's okay. Did you hear what my last note was? I went D. That's 2 beats, right? So you know that the last note is going to be a tie and a half note underneath it because you heard 2 beats. Okay, here's the whole thing again, and then we'll split it up. Here we go. D, 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 D. Okay, here's the first measure alone, all right? Here we go. D, D, D. So there is a silence at the end of it. Okay, here's the second measure, just the second measure alone. Here we go. D, 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 D. Okay, now I'm going to do the whole thing, and you check and see if you got it right or get any of those last notes. All right, here we go. Good luck. D, 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 D. All right, you ready for the answer? So there it is. Let me get rid of that. So D, 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 D. And then on notes, it's half, ete, qua, half. Sweet. Okay, so you did it. Hey, thanks for being here with me today, and I hope you have a great rest of your Friday. Comment down below if you're going to do anything out of the ordinary this weekend. I don't think I am. We're getting new lights and a fan installed right now, so I guess I can call that as our unusual thing. So, okay, be safe, make good choices, and I will see you later. Bye.